So now we embark on our journey through the digestive system. This is a very long chapter, and it begins with looking at the general anatomy and digestive processes. We'll look at the mouth through the esophagus, and then food passes into the stomach. We'll look at accessory organs, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. We'll examine the functions of the small intestine. We'll consider chemical digestion and absorption, and finally we'll look at the large intestine. First of all, we need to consider that most of the nutrients we eat cannot be used in their existing form. They have to be broken down into much smaller components. Now consider, for example, if you eat a steak, and that steak is made up of muscle, and inside the muscle cells there's actin and myosin filaments. Now, you can't just use the actin and myosin that's in the steak to make your own actin and myosin. However, when we break down the steak, we chemically digest it into its monomers. The myosin is broken down into many, many monomers of amino acids. We absorb those amino acids, and then we incorporate them into our own proteins. So they may become myosin, or they may become insulin, or they may become any other protein. So the digestive system is essentially a disassembly line. We're going to break down nutrients into a form that can be used by the body, and then we're going to absorb them so that they can be distributed to the tissues. The study of the digestive tract and diagnosis of its issues is called gastroenterology. Digestive function. The digestive system is an organ system that processes foods, extracts nutrients from it, and eliminates the residue. And all of this digestive function happens in 5 stages. Ingestion, which is our selective intake of food because we have a choice. Digestion, which is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food into a form that's usable by the body. We have to have both mechanical, breaking food down into smaller chunks, and chemical, breaking it down into monomers so that food can be absorbed and used by the body. Absorption is the uptake of these nutrient molecules by the epithelial cells that line the digestive tract. They're transported through the epithelial cells and then into the blood and lymph. On the tail end of the 5 stages, we have compaction, which is where we're going to absorb water and consolidate the indigestible residue and produce feces. Finally, the removal of feces is the phase called defecation. Mechanical digestion and chemical digestion, as I've said, are slightly different. Mechanical digestion is physically breaking down food into smaller particles, cutting and grinding action of the teeth, the churning muscular action of the stomach and small intestines. So this cutting and churning creates more surface area on the particles of food to aid the action of the digestive enzymes. So chemical digestion is just that, putting the digestive enzymes into place. It's a series of hydrolysis reactions. Remember from general biology, hydrolysis, to break apart water, breaking apart each of the monomers, monosaccharides, amino acids, whatever, we insert water. Right? One OH goes to one side, another OH goes to the other. This process is carried out by digestive enzymes. We'll examine them in much more detail later, but they can be produced by the salivary glands, the stomach, the pancreas, or the small intestine. The results are that we see polysaccharides cut into monosaccharides, proteins into their monomer amino acids, fats into monoglycerides and fatty acids, and nucleic acids into nucleotides. some nutrients are already usable in their digested form, so we don't need to do chemical or mechanical digestion. Things like vitamins, amino acids that are already free, not part of another protein, some minerals, cholesterol, and water. The general anatomy of the digestive system is broken into two divisions. The digestive tract itself, or the alimentary canal, which is basically a 30-foot long muscular tube. It extends from the mouth to the anus and has lots of convolutions along the way. It consists of the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The gastrointestinal tract technically is just the stomach and intestines. Accessory organs are also very important. The teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So the digestive tract's open to the environment at both ends. Technically, it's not considered that any of the food that comes out the other end has ever been in the body, because technically it's just been in this tract that runs right through the middle. It's open at the mouth, it's open at the anus. A lot of material passes through. Some of it is actually absorbed by the epithelial cells of the alimentary canal, and thus we consider it has entered the body tissues. Now we take a look at the various layers of this hollow 30-foot long tube. All components of it follow this basic structural plan. The wall consists of the following tissue layers. First, we have the mucosa, then the submucosa, the muscularis externa, which consists of 2 layers of muscle, and then the serosa on the very outside. So we'll begin with the mucosa. The mucosa, or mucous membrane, is composed of 3 portions itself. We have the inner epithelium, which is made up of simple columnar cells through most of the digestive tract, or stratified squamous from the mouth through the esophagus, and again in the lower anal canal. The lamina propria is this layer right below the simple columnar, and it's basically made of loose connective tissue. The muscularis mucosa is this thin layer of smooth muscle. It tenses the mucosa, creating grooves and ridges, and that enhances the surface area and thus increases contact with food. So we improve the efficiency of digestion and nutrient absorption because of the muscularis mucosa, which is this little orange layer right in here. We'll also see that there is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Now you'll remember about this from our chapter on the lymphatic system. MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Next we have the submucosa. The submucosa is a thick layer of loose connective tissue. It contains the blood vessels, contains nerves, and sometimes some mucus secreting glands. The submucosa you can see here right below the orange layer. Some places we'll see the MALT extending into the submucosa. Next, the muscularis externa. The muscularis externa we can see as 2 layers of muscle. There's the inner layer, which is circular, going around the gut tube, and then the outer layer, which is longitudinal muscle fibers. The longitudinal layer is the one that actually propels food and residue through the tract, so it contracts against the volume of food that's in there and pushes it further down through the system. The inner circular layer in some places thickens to form sphincters that regulate the flow of materials in and out of the various portions of the digestive tract. Finally, we look at the serosa. The serosa is composed of a thin layer of areolar tissue topped by simple squamous mesothelium. It begins just below the esophagus and ends just before the rectum. The adventitia, again, is a fibrous connective tissue layer, and that's going to bind and blend the pharynx and esophagus and the rectum into adjacent connective tissue of other organs. So you'll see this in dissections. These organs don't peel apart so easily because of the connective tissue of the adventitia. Now, the enteric nervous system is often considered to be part of the autonomic nervous system, but opinions on its classification vary significantly. But it's a network of neurons that act independently from the central nervous system that surrounds the esophagus, the stomach, and intestines, and they regulate digestive tract motility, the secretions of substances into the digestive tract, and blood flow around the digestive tract. The system's made up of over 100 million neurons. That's more neurons than we see in the spinal cord. And as I said, it can function completely independently of the central nervous system, although it does send sensory information to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system can exert an influence on its action. Without any central nervous system input, it would still manage to function properly. The enteric nervous system is composed of two different networks of neurons. There's the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. The submucosal plexus is in the submucosa. It's mainly involved in control of glandular secretions, and it controls the movements of the muscularis mucosa. The myenteric plexus primarily involves parasympathetic ganglia. You'll remember those from last semester when we talked about the parasympathetic system and the ganglia that are close to the digestive organs. And it also involves nerve fibers that lay between the two layers of the muscularis interna. These fibers control peristalsis, the action of squeezing things through the digestive tube, and also other contractions of the muscularis interna. So you'll remember from the previous slide that the esophagus, the pharynx, and the rectum are surrounded by this extra tissue layer called the adventitia, and that binds it in place into adjacent organs. In processing food, the stomach and the intestines undergo such strenuous contractions that it's important they're not really attached to anything. They need this freedom to move around in the abdominal cavity. Thus, they're loosely bound to the abdominal wall by connective tissue sheets called mesenteries. They allow the stomach and intestines to undergo contractions, freedom of movement in the abdominal cavity so that as we twist and turn, we don't see twists and tangles in the small intestine. They hold the abdominal viscera in the proper relationship to each other. They form pockets and pouches to hold everything in the right place. And they also provide a passage for blood vessels and nerves that supply the digestive tract, as well as containing many lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels to take care of infection as it arises. You'll remember the parietal peritoneum from early in the study of anatomy and physiology. We looked at all the linings of the different cavities and linings of the viscera. In the abdominal cavity, it was the peritoneal cavity that's surrounded by the parietal peritoneum. So this is the layer of serous membrane that lines the wall of the abdominal cavity. Along the posterior midline of the body, it turns inwards. So now we have a double sheet of what was parietal peritoneum coming in to form the dorsal mesentery. That sheet then separates again as it rounds any of the organs that come into its way, forming the serosa, the visceral serosa, or the visceral peritoneum in this case. And then again, they come together on the far side of the organ and continue in another double sheet of tissue that's called the ventral mesentery. So you can see here on the figure to the right that we have the mesenteries, the dorsal mesenteries here connecting the organs to the back wall of the body. The ventral mesenteries we can see over in the figure on the left. The lesser omentum here is a smaller piece of omentum membrane that's attached to the lesser curvature of the stomach. So the small curve of the stomach on the superior aspect. And it attaches the stomach to the liver. The greater omentum, however, hangs from the greater curvature of the stomach, and it hangs down like an apron over all of the intestines. On its inferior edge, down here, it folds back up upon itself, forming a deep pouch between the superficial and deep layers. The inner superior margin forms the serous membranes around the spleen and the transverse colon. The mesocolon is an extension of the mesentery. So the mesocolon here anchors the colon, the large intestine, to the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. Now, as you can see, most of these organs are connected somehow within the peritoneal lining to the back wall. Those that are entirely enclosed by mesentery on both sides, as in they have a serous lining, are called intraperitoneal because they are within the organ cavity, or because they are within the peritoneal cavity. Such organs are the stomach, the liver, parts of the small and large intestine. We've examined a couple of organs already that are retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal means behind the peritoneum, so they don't push through into the peritoneum and become lined or covered with a serosa. They're behind the peritoneal lining. The kidneys were a great example of this, and they're considered to be outside of the peritoneal cavity. The duodenum, a region of the small intestine, the pancreas, and some parts of the large intestine are retroperitoneal. So how are all these digestive functions regulated? There are three basic mechanisms. The neural control that we've looked at a little bit already, hormones, and then paracrine secretions. Short reflexes of myenteric origin result primarily from stretch of a local area in the intestine and subsequent contraction against that stretch. That causes the peristaltic action of swallowing. We swallow a bolus of food, and the muscles of the esophagus squeeze against that and push it further down through the tube. This action continues throughout the digestive system. We'll also see chemical stimulation can act through myenteric plexuses. Then we have long reflexes, or vagovagal reflexes, which are where we see parasympathetic stimulation of digestive motility and secretion. So this is where we have a sensory signal being sent to the central nervous system and a motor effect coming back from the parasympathetic division. There are hormones, chemical messengers that are secreted into the bloodstream, and they're going to stimulate distant parts of the digestive tract as blood flows past that region. We'll also see gastrin secretion. We'll examine its role later. In addition, there are paracrine secretions. Paracrines are chemical messengers that diffuse through the tissue fluids very locally and stimulate very nearby target cells. So this concludes our first section on the digestive system, its general anatomy and digestive processes. You're now ready to move on to the second portion, where we'll cover the mouth down through the esophagus.